Good day, everyone. My work is entitled Hegemony and American Imperialism in the Philippines. To preface this presentation, I'd like to mention that this remains to be a work in progress as I have not fully engaged in detail the interplay between Gramscian notion of hegemony and manufacture of consent and American imperial interference in the Philippines. I also like to mention that the lenses of American or the study of my study in terms of American imperialism um, lean, or if I may say, leans towards a certain bias that is, of course, I'm looking at it, no, through the lenses of the one of the nationalist thinkers and political economists, Alejandro Lichauco. In fact, my fascination towards this subject is simply a product of my close reading of the Lichauco paper written in the 70s. Now, the paper is an attempt to link Gramscian theory of hegemony and American imperialism in the Philippines. Well, attention of the subject, I believe, hinges on the question of how and why the Filipinos remain subservient to American foreign economic policies, despite the obvious exploitative measures it subjected the Philippine government in the post-Commonwealth era. Now, this work therefore would answer these three research questions. First, of course, what is Gramsci's theory of hegemony and manufacture of consent? Second, how did American imperialism operate in, Alejandro Lichauco's work? And lastly, how is Gramsci's notion of hegemony utilized by the American government to maintain its influence in the Philippines up to today? So let me first briefly talk about Antonio Gramsci and his theory of hegemony and his manufacture of consent. Well, Antonio Gramsci, of course, is an Italian political theorist and activist in Italy. Of course, his work is entitled Quaderni del Calcere, or Prison Notebooks of 1926, which attempts to simply revitalize the agonistic theme of Marxian political and sociological theory. He contends that the nature of power dynamics, as described by Marx and Lenin, as mere symptomatic manifestations of conflict. For example, the bourgeois and the proletariat, the oppressor and oppressor, and its eventual rupture and collapse. No? An analysis and projection, in fact, of power structures which has obviously failed when capitalism itself did not succumb to its internal contradictions. To explain why there was no collapse, Gramsci introduces the notion of hegemony, which permeates and manifests across socio-political spheres such as morality, customs, religion, and culture. Well, he defines hegemony simply as the predominance obtained by consent rather than force of one class or group over the other classes. Here, domination is no longer legitimized through antagonism diffused by the superiority of certain social classes, but through consent, which Gramsci maintains to be the result of being convinced. Well, this is not to say that the bourgeois dominance only thrives behind subtle manufacturing of consent, but also through material and economic domination. That is, by controlling the mode of production and the relation of production. Yet the way in which it remains legitimate is secured by the superstructure through ideological hegemony. This shows that the legitimacy of authority, which in Weberian context is necessary in maintaining political and social dominance, is achieved by controlling the infrastructure and legitimizing its dominance through ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, which Althusser would later comment. No? Yet the notion of consent controls the emotive and psychological stimulus response patterns of the individual, which may definitely result into aggressive and violent retaliation or an attempt, in fact, to overturn the dominant political and social paradigm. Thus, creating a false consciousness becomes critical in manufacturing consent. Fast forward, of course, to later critiques against bourgeois hegemony. The likes, for example, of Althusser, Marcuse, Foucault, Freire, would argue that the domination is sustained through pervasive and insidious ideological values that shapes the consciousness of the subject. Here, consent still seems to come forth despite the realities of injustice and exploitation, which leads Gramsci to believe that this consent is mere incapacity of the social agent to comprehend and express and articulate their aspirations. And so for Gramsci, the agent's consent sprouts again from This false consciousness with which an act becomes detrimental to their socio-political and cultural identities and determination. In this manner, knowledge is a product of a social construct which makes it rather potent in rejecting the praxis of hegemony. As much as knowledge has been used to create a false consciousness which lures the individual into consent to the bourgeois hegemony, it could also be utilized to steer the individual's consciousness towards resistance. However, without the external demystification and the rejection of dominant values, the prospects of social transformation remains intangible. In challenging the dominant power structure, the subject has to internally resist, and reject the hegemonic powers through counter-hegemonic revolution, which brings this awakening of individuals' critical consciousness, leading to the emergence of a morally integrated society. Well, the stronghold of hegemony is exactly that it captures the universal interest of society, which legitimizes the authority and control of the bourgeois. Right? Thus, as Gramsci would have us believe, ideological hegemony is only possible through practical measures in the material base. In relative parlance, the ideology carries the necessity to materialize its agenda in the mode and relations of production. Well, the challenge is to convince the subject that these ideals and directives are for the universal interest of society in order to sustain legitimacy of their control. Intuitively, the repressive mode of control does not manufacture consent, but in fact immediately what we call eruptive revolt. No, in this manner, hegemony is not defined simply as an ideological control, but a strategic utilization of state powers, both material and ideological, right? In achieving, of course, the interest of the proletariat. This means that the dominant class, in order to gain legitimacy, would need to meet the interest of the proletariat to hide the contradiction in the mode of production. Therefore, the bourgeois hegemony would need to find the equilibrium of control just enough to pacify the proletariat and sustain economic and material hegemony. In fact, for Gramsci, this is possible by catering to the interest of the subordinate classes, but not to the extent of giving everything, for it would topple over the position of the dominant class. Thus, the dominant class concession to the subordinate classes would have to be done. It would have to be done within limitations. That is, such a compromise cannot touch the essential economic and political order. In this manner, the capitalist economic paradigm should be maintained in order to maintain hegemony, which in so doing should not affect the profits of the capitalist, as it secures the existence of a dominant class. Profits and revenues, needless to mention, reproduces the mode of production. Yet the dominant class ought to not amass profit for themselves too much, as it would create an unstable equilibrium, at the same time not too giving and generous to the subordinate class, so as to pose instability to their hegemony. Now, economic hegemony is, of course, critical in the manufacturing of consent. Yet, of course, it is insufficient in establishing a hegemonic class. This means that in order for the dominant class to sustain its control, it had to transcend purely economic class at the material base. Gramsci contends, in fact, that the legitimating factor rests in the superstructure, maintaining the compromise in the mode of production or the material base. In this manner, the ideological superstructure, such as politics, culture, religion, the school system or the family system, law and public opinion, would have to be structured and ordered in such a way that it corresponds to the justification and legitimation of economic order. This is exactly why, for instance, American interference in the Philippines is not isolated to economic policies alone and financial aids. The agenda necessarily involved ideological influences that condition the government and the Filipino people to remain under the wings of American occupation. Now, let me talk about the Lichauco paper, what it is all about, and how this relates to my discussion with Gramsci. Now, Of course, the Lichauco paper is a position paper, no, or an anti-manifesto to American imperialism. Well, Lichauco believes that the Philippines have a fighting chance to emerge as as an economic superpower if there are radical reforms to the key economic and political positions of the Constitution. Right in the paper I mentioned, I could give it later as a kind of a peer review. I mentioned that the context of this work was, of course, the drafting of the 1973 Constitution, where Lichauco was one of the 320 delegates in the Constitutional Convention. The work does more, in fact, than serve as an anti-manifesto or a position to American imperialist agenda, as it did two things in my perspective. That is, first, to, of course, expose American imperialist interests in the Philippines and discuss the current status of the Philippine economy, which in so doing recalibrate the direction of the Constitutional Convention. Thus, of course, it is also aimed towards some extent of social change. Now, Lichauco as would say, that the poverty in the Philippines is inevitable, precisely because the economic conditions does not allow a vibrant economy. The question is, what kind of economy sustains the Philippine market? At this point, of course, it was the Philippine market's sole dependence to agricultural merchandising sector, which for Lichauco will never suffice the demand of employment and industrialization. He directly identifies the presence of American imperialism in the Philippines as the primary culprit of this phenomenon. Now, as I will discuss it a little later, the impact has become ingrained in the structure in the guise of economic policies and constitutional, provisions. Lichauco directly pinpoints internal factors that serve as means for imperial mechanization to enter the Philippine economy. So in the succeeding sections, I will only discuss the key arguments of Lichauco in his work, which could be summarized by categorizing key components of imperialism in the Philippines. Of course, first would be pro-American Filipino precedents. Second, free trade and foreign investment or foreign capital. Third, adherence to monetary fiscal policies for foreign aid. And lastly, the role of media and education. Now, for Lichauco, these factors incapacitated the Filipinos or the Philippines to develop heavy industries, which could in fact catapult the Philippine agricultural merchandising economy into modern industrial superpower. Let me first talk about these pro-American Filipino presidents. I will not discuss them in the extent, but look at the contributions of these presidents towards American interest. No? So we begin with the likes of Manuel Rojas. So President Manuel Rojas, of course, delivered the Bell Trade Act. Okay, what is the Bell Trade Act all about? Well, it is an agreement that in order for the Philippines to receive the post-war rehabilitation fund of $620 million, okay, certain provisions in economy and policies concerning land ownership should be amended. And so what are they? Okay, first, of course, it opened the country to free trade, okay, and opened the Philippines into American parity rights, which basically allowed Americans to dispose, exploit, develop, and utilize all agricultural, timber, and mineral lands. Of course, later on, Rojas also helped concretize the military bases agreement of 1947, which lasted for 99 years. Well, next up is Elpidio Quirino. This is well known. His administration has been practically swamped by the interference of American advisors through the Quirino-Foster agreement. At least he took more independent foreign policy later on, which of course made the U.S. kicking him out of office and support none other but Ramon Magsaysay, which of course has been funded by the CIA. But what is the result of Ramon Magsaysay's presidency? Well, as is well known, it catered to the Laurel-Langley Agreement, which expanded parity rights for Americans not only to utilize natural resources, for them to also own all forms of businesses. As a matter of fact, the reason why Magsaysay has been kicked out of the Nacionalista Party is precisely because of this policy. We have, of course, next up is Carlos P. Garcia. Of course, we know him for his Filipino First policy, and of course he is going a little bit against the socio-economic paradigm at that particular time. And of course it was during his time where heavy industries were developed during his presidency, which may have in fact contributed to the Philippine economy. And of course we also have Diosdado Macapagal, which of course opened further the Philippine economy to free trade and through the decontrol program and what we call the floating of the peso. We of course know Marcos to have continued this even in fact he promised, that he would repudiate this American agenda in the Philippines. Of course, next would be free trade and foreign capital. Now, on the one hand, free trade, which fosters and allows foreign capital, exploits the Philippine economy through disproportionate profits. It withdraws from the country to the United States for the purpose of discussion. Let me just highlight an example. Both Villegas and Lichaco extends in their Investment Incentives Act of 1966 and Export Incentive Act of 1970. For instance, when a foreign investment invests in the Philippines, for example, say $1, when a foreign investment invests in the Philippines in that manner, how much do you think would be the return? Well, according to the studies of Lichaco in the 1970s, in order to attract businesses from the outside, the foreign investment returns would be $10, okay, from every $1 invested in the country. Well, this is the socio-economic paradigm during the 70s. Now, another thing to consider is the swarming presence of foreign capital in the Philippines, which shows that a total of 743 corporations in the Philippines since 1946 were foreign. Imagine the extent of economic suctioning these legislative provisions cost the Philippine economy, not to mention the modus operandi of other companies and subsidiaries of international corporations. What some of these corporations are doing is to practically borrow capital from the local institutions and later send back the profit to their mother companies. In turn, as a consequence, while foreign direct investments bring more jobs and opportunities of economic growth, it actually robs the Philippines, the Philippine local economy, of the chance to sustain its own economic activities. Next up would be foreign aids and loans. Of course, for Lichaco, foreign aids and loans always comes with certain trade-offs. Okay, as mentioned earlier, the Bell Trade Act of 1946, is agreed upon over an exchange, the post-war rehabilitation fund. And so foreign financial aids or loans are bargaining chip to institute economic policies that serve the imperialist agenda. Okay, a critical aspect of this enterprise is the role of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. Now, these two institutions play a central role in the stabilization or destabilization of an economy. Right? These financial institutions are responsible in loaning monetary assistance to save an economy from complete collapse. And so once a country runs out of foreign reserve, which happens through the devaluation of the peso and its dependence on imports, the outflow of capital, if it is predisposed, it is predisposed to loan stabilization funds, which are released only if the country borrower would adhere to certain changes in monetary and fiscal policies. Lichaco notes that there appears to be these four conditions that the debtor applicant should maintain. First, of course, would be to continue to run its economy on an open basis, meaning that there should be no restrictions on its imports as well as on flight capital from its jurisdiction. Second, the debtor applicant encourage foreign investments as a factor necessary to the development of the economy. And third, it pursue a policy of monetary and fiscal stringency. Finally, in cases requiring drastic measures to rectify a chronic imbalance in its international reserves, is that it devalue the currency. Now, these conditions can be discerned is to maintain the status quo of economic dependence to the foreign capital in order to further expand its reach in the local market. Now, Lichaco argues that once the country succumbs to international trade and, much worse, foreign investments, it already directs its own economy in natural resources towards exploitation. Now, the question is, of course, the contradiction is very obvious. We could see how the Philippine economy is, exploited. How is it still possible that they continue? Okay. Well, the question here is, how are these interests legitimized? Well, of course, there are three things that he mentions. First, of course, would be education and media. Under education and media, he would say that through the technocrats, or these, well-known, if I may say, government leaders, particularly experts in economics and, of course, political economy in particular, would serve as a kind of legitimacy, because they're experts in the field. And so he mentions, for instance, certain technocrats during that time. Of course, this is a kind of attempt to itemize, who are these American, if I may say, who are serving American interests, right? Technocrats, for instance, would say would be the Department of Finance Secretary Cesar Virata, Gerardo Sicat, and Vicente Porteno of the uh, Bureau of Investments. No, well, he would say that these government officials, along many others, propagandize the idea that we need foreign investments to aid economic growth, open market further to essentially open the market to the world, no, to the extent of making it more diverse, etc., to make it a multilateral economy, and later on remove existing restrictions in the constitution. And he would also say that it's because of the educational system. Okay, to reproduce, of course, such motivations, which Chauco argues, no, that these ideals would have to trickle down into the universities and learning institutions. For Lichauco, education became the Trojan horse of contemporary imperialism. This perpetuates and reproduces the colonial complex. Okay, because it injects and banks values, attitudes, and institutional structures that condition the mind of the people to internalize and appropriate neo-colonial ideals, the ideals of the oppressors, essentially. Now, it is also in this notion that Lichaco argued that through education, imperialism was able to inject its culture and values through the school system, right? Later, of course, he would say that it's also because of the mass media, okay, because the mass media is very powerful in, of course, legitimizing, of course, spreading certain information. He would say that mass media empowered and funded by businesses and corporations, of course, though by principle should serve as an instrument of information and truth, merely becomes an instrument of imperialism. Now, he would say that there are a couple of good media outlets, like Manila Chronicle, of course, in his time, the Manila Times, Daily Mirror, Free Press, and the Graphic. But the others choose to not speak about these, problems or these instances of exploitation in the Philippines, right? These media companies essentially promote certain ideals that justifies the importance of foreign presence in the Philippines, Philippine economy, politics, and culture. Now, to conclude, I know I'm running out of time. I went beyond 2 minutes, but let me just conclude this work. Now, the evidence of hegemony and its strategies, of course, is very clear, incoherent in Lichauco's work. It is clear that the tactical tool of American imperial agenda is not restricted to economic policies that carries inevitable formative impact to the Philippine government, okay, but ideological and superstructural mechanisms that ensures the dependence of the Filipino people to the hegemon. Now, how is this done? Of course, as discussed earlier, the academe played a huge role in legitimizing capitalistic social formation. For instance, some of the academics who argued for the necessity of foreign capital and investment in the Philippines in order to steer the country towards economic development were influential members of the socio-civic community. These public figures were instrumental in rendering the presence of colonial powers to be indispensable to the prospect of socio-economic development. Also, media in this manner also plays a huge role in creating normative narrative, okay, that promotes imperialist agenda. The Chaco notes that only a few news agencies, as mentioned earlier, actively scrutinizes the apparatuses of imperialism in the Philippines, while the rest, okay, serves the interest of neocolonial powers by being silent about it. And so for Lichaco, media is a very potent tool in catalyzing the direction of public perception, in this case, the promotion of the interests of colonialism by either crediting or discrediting personalities in the political arena. As can be seen in the US-Philippine political paradigm, the political figure whose economic policies favor the interests of the United States may necessarily gain popularity, okay, and thus the presidency, if they are well promoted, for instance. So the pattern is repetitive, which could still be observed in the contemporary Philippine politics. So without a doubt, the Philippine economy remains subservient to foreign policies or foreign powers, and its independence arguably has become nominal. Its political decisions unwittingly remain adherent to external pressures, and its cultural identity patterned after its oppressors. Now, Lichaco argues, at least in the aspect of economics, that the Philippine economy then in the 1970s has reached a point of no return, given the depth of its debt and its overdependence to free market. Well, the floating of its currency and its failure to develop local industries which could have hoisted its economy as a superpower, has demoralized not only its entrepreneurs but the consciousness of the Filipino people. In fact, the ramifications of yesterday's exploitative economic policies obviously has tremendous impact to present socio-economic, political, and even cultural landscape. The aftermath being the massive and deepening poverty of our Filipino people, the rising unemployment, the inflation that has gone beyond control, which does not only affect the status of the economy, but critically the lives of millions of Filipinos. The same Filipino who has been blamed for perennial poverty as a result of his indolence. That would be it. Of course, I'll be open to questions later. Of course, I have not fully and extensively discussed, Lichalco, but hopefully I was able to present the key concepts of Lichalco and key concepts in Gramsci's theory of hegemony and manufacture of consent. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye bye.